Today we're going to start talking about a new topic that will only kind of stay on for a few days, actually. We're going to start talking about genetic engineering of organisms. And we're going to start off with this one, this version of it called selective breeding, which is very easy to understand. So just a really quick review, because it's kind of critical to today's lesson, is we really need to focus on mutations, these changes in the genetic code. And one thing that's important about mutations is that mutations are what give organisms new traits. Now, we looked at a bunch of examples where those mutations are bad things. They could cause different diseases, they could cause genetic disorders, but there are a set of mutations that are good. Remember, I said the example of like maybe the llama doodle that looks super attractive might attract more mates. So that's a good example of a mutation. Some mutations are good for you. We talked about the example of HIV resistance in some individuals. So some mutations are good for you, and those mutations can get passed on. And that's what's going to allow organisms to kind of be bred selectively for these traits, is as new traits can pop up in these organisms, humans can specifically breed organisms for those traits. So let's look at what we're going to look at today and start talking about is this unit on genetic engineering. And genetic engineering is all about designing organisms to fit our needs. So that sounds kind of drastic, but it's all about kind of manipulating living organisms to help humans. Some simple examples of this, as you'll see, are things like domesticated cattle for food, or dogs that maybe help us hunt, or catch pests or things like that. So we're going to look at that example today, and that's the first of two methods of genetic engineering called selective breeding. And then in the future we're going to look at something called recombinant DNA, which is actually cutting and editing the DNA of living organisms, which is really cool. So let's talk about selective breeding today. And selective breeding is when humans choose to mate or breed certain organisms to keep desirable traits and get rid of unwanted traits. So it basically means breeding certain organisms together to get a certain outcome. And you can see an example of this cow here. This doesn't look like your typical cow. This is called a Belgian blue cow, and it's been bred specifically to have a lot of meat, so it could feed a lot of people. Right, so this is an example of a cow that has been bred specifically to be really, really big, so it could feed a lot of people. But that's an example of selective breeding. Maybe one of the coolest examples of selective breeding kind of explain this is if you ever saw the movie Secretariat or heard of Secretariat, is a horse, and he won the Triple Crown in 1973, and people paid over $6 million to breed their horses with Secretariat. So they paid over $6 million to have Secretariat be the father to some horse puppies. And you could ask yourself, well, why would people pay so much? Well, the Secretariat won a bunch of horse races that made him a lot of money, so people were breeding their horses with Secretariat in the hopes that their horses would be just as fast as him. So they were trying to make fast horse babies. But it just gives you an example of how kind of extreme this can get. But it's all about trying to breed for certain traits. And this isn't anything new. Humans have been doing this for thousands of years. One of the best examples is corn. Everyone's familiar with corn on the cob. But the truth is that corn doesn't exist in nature in the wild. You can't go out into the woods and find a natural corn plant. What you can find is this plant over here called teosinte, which is a small grain. And so what humans have done is over hundreds and thousands of years, humans would find this teosinte plant, and they would find the teosinte plant with the biggest kernels, the most kernels, and they would breed that with other teosinte plants that had big kernels. And then over time, the plants got bigger and bigger and bigger until it gave us corn. You can look at some examples of this, something like a wild cow versus the cows that we typically see. They're quite different. Same thing with pigs. If you find a wild boar, it's not the same as the modern pig that you see that we farm for food. That's because humans have selectively bred certain traits in these organisms to get what they want. And one of the things is that selective breedings can have very large effects, even after a small amount of time. One of the the easiest examples to see of this is in dog breeds, right? Both of these organisms are dogs. They're both the same species. They're both Canis domesticus. But if you look, both dogs are drastically different. This dog maybe weighs 6 pounds, and this dog maybe weighs 100 pounds. They look completely different, even though they're the exact same species of organism. And that's because humans, again, have selectively bred for certain traits. I want a small dog, I want a big dog, I want a dog with pointy ears, I want a dog with floppy ears. And they choose the parents over and over again until they get the dog that they want. One thing that I should say about selective breeding is that it has its limits. So you can kind of enhance traits that already exist, but you can't really create traits from nothing. You can't make a flying pig, for example, because pigs will never have wings. Now, if one pig had a genetic mutation that gave him wings, sure, you could breed that pig over and over and over again and make lots of baby pigs with wings, but until a pig shows up with wings, you're not going to be able to make a pig with wings. So you can only enhance mutations that are already in the population. So let's look at some examples of selective breeding. And basically, selective breeding, there are two techniques. The first one is called inbreeding, and the second one is called hybridization. So let's talk about each of those and how they can kind of yield organisms that kind of fit our needs. So the first example is called inbreeding. And inbreeding is used when you take organisms with similar traits and you breed them together to keep or enhance those traits. So for example, you can see these two dogs look almost exactly the same. So if you want to kind of keep that dog, what would you do? Well, you wouldn't breed, say, this dog with a big pit bull, because then you get something in the middle. You're going to breed these two dogs together, mother and father, to get more dogs that look the same. This is called inbreeding. So it basically keeps the genetic pool as close as possible, so you don't get much variation. You keep the traits that you have. And if you go back to the corn plant, this is a perfect example. Inbreeding can be done to enhance traits that you already have. So let's say if you have, you want a really big dog, right? Or you want to make a really big dog breed. You're going to go out there, you're going to find the biggest mother dog and the biggest father dog, and you're going to breed them together in the hopes that you're going to get even bigger babies. That's inbreeding. The opposite of that is hybridization. And hybridization is used when you take organisms with different traits and breed them together in hopes of getting the best of both traits from both organisms. So if you take two completely different organisms, maybe you take a really large dog who has sharp teeth and you breed it with a really small dog with pointy ears, and you're hoping to get a big dog with pointy ears. So you're combining organisms together that have very drastically different traits in hopes of getting the perfect mix. And you can see an example here is the lion and tiger mix called a liger. That's kind of different because you're using two different species, but it's an example of hybridization, taking organisms with drastically different traits and mixing them together to get a mix of the both traits. One thing I should say about selective breeding, especially about inbreeding, less about hybridization, is that it's not always successful. So you're breeding these organisms that might have different traits in the hopes of getting the best of both, but sometimes the opposite can happen and you can't get the worst of both. And this happens all the time with dog breeders. Dog breeders will commonly inbreed dogs from the same family, from the same litter, and over time that inbreeding means that any sort of genetic mutations that exist get passed on, any genetic diseases that exist get passed on. When you stop having that variation in a population, it's more likely that you'll get kind of genetic defects in your organism. And you can see this poor dog here has plenty of genetic defects, and that's a result of too much inbreeding. So to do this correctly, breeders have to be very smart about it. They have to keep very accurate records about who breeds with who and making sure that you're adding enough genetic variation into the population. Basically, the way it works is every kind of mother and father has to have lots and lots of children so you can pick from those children the best to mate. And then as you can see, as you go through these family trees, it's always a good idea to add members in from outside the family. So a lot of breeders will find mates from other sides of the country in order to keep adding genetic variability to their population of organisms that they're making. So just important to note that it's not always successful, but the idea is that combining to get the best of both. And you can see that if you keep going through these selective breeding techniques, what ends up happening is you get a lot of variation or a lot of variety in the types of organisms, which is something that humans have done really well with dog breeds. You can see all the different breeds of dog. They're all the same species. They're all dogs, but they're very genetically different. And that's because humans have spent hundreds and thousands of years breeding dogs to do certain jobs. So some dogs do the job of pulling sleds for us. Some dogs do the job of hunting for us and retrieving for us. Some do the job of herding sheep for us. So all these dogs have been bred for specific traits. Some are strong, some are quick and fast, some have very good eyesight. They've been bred for all these specific traits for them to do jobs for us. So it's being very strategic about breeding organisms. So what I want you to do now is you're going to practice actually playing the role of a breeder. And I want you to try to figure out, well, which organisms are best to breed, and should I be inbreeding or hybridizing my dogs to kind of get the best traits. So for every question, I'm going to give you a scenario and a list of dogs. And your job is to figure out one of two things. Number one, should I hybridize or should I inbreed? And then the other thing you want is, if you're hybridizing, what two dogs? Or should I say, if you're hybridizing or inbreeding, which two or one dog? So let's look at an example of this, right? Lewis wants a dog, but he lives in the city, so it needs to be a small dog. But he also wants a dog that's good with children and doesn't require a lot of brushing. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at our different dogs, and we're going to look at the traits and try to find the ones that best match Lewis's description of his ideal dog. Now, it may be one dog has all the traits, or it may be I want to mix and match two dogs together. So what we can do is we can look at the traits that Lewis wants. So the first thing he said, he lives in the city, so it needs to be a small dog. And he wants a dog that's good with children and doesn't require a lot of brushing. So we're trying to find the best of these three categories. So the first thing we might do is look at size over here and try to find some small dogs. The Corgi's a small dog, and the Westie's a small dog. So we have to ask ourselves, well, are these good dogs for Lewis? Well, we can look and see, are they good with children? Okay. Well, if you look at the Corgi here, this is interesting. Looking at the Corgi is great with children. So the Corgi matches two of Lewis's description. But one thing that you notice is that Lewis wants a dog that doesn't want a lot of brushing, and the Corgi needs daily brushing. Well, if I think about it though, the Westie over here, I only need to brush it weekly. So that doesn't require a lot of brushing. So maybe what I might want to do is mix the Corgi, because it's small and great with children, with the Westie, because it doesn't require a lot of brushing. And so maybe I can get a dog that has all three of these traits by mixing the two together. So my answer to this might be that I'm going to hybridize, and my two dogs will be the Corgi and the Westie, because the Corgi is small and great with children, and the Westie is small and only needs brushing weekly. So I'm combining those two dogs. I'm hybridizing to try to get the best traits of both. So you go ahead and give that a try in your worksheet. Remember, there's really no wrong